Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Sherry Shish. I am the designer of the Wave Pool Block of the Month, and this month we are working on month 4. So that is pages 11 and 12 in the pattern. And if you don't have a copy of the pattern, see the description, and there are also quilt kits left if you would like to make this exact quilt. So let's get started. Today, what will be super handy is if you have these clearly perfect angles. This will help you make your half square triangles without drawing all of your lines. If you don't have these, make sure that you have a good Frixion pen and a ruler, and you'll be drawing some diagonals instead of using this. The other thing that is super helpful is trimmer A. There we go. Trimmer A of the clearly perfect slotted trimmers. These will be super helpful for you to trim down your half square triangles and makes this quilt significantly faster. These are things that you should have had from previous months, and things will keep going. Hi Deanna, hi Hard Made Easy, hello. All right, so for month 4, we have 4 different types of fabric. I already have all of these pre-cut, plus our background. It's fabric B, C, G, and H. And because I'm going to be making one set of blocks each, there are 2 different types of blocks that we're making today. I have just pulled enough fabric to make one single block, but you will be using every single piece that I have pre-cut for all of the blocks that are actually necessary for the quilt. You have 4 of the first block and 2 of the larger blocks to make. So I'm going to go ahead and put these away. I'm going to start with half square triangles. So we have quite a few half square triangles to make. So I have these already picked out. So we have half square triangles to make between these 2 fabrics, these 2 fabrics, and then we have a couple of the blue and the shells. And then we also have our hourglass blocks. Now for hourglass blocks, they're going to be done a little bit differently. And the reason is with hourglass blocks, you don't trim until the very, very end. So we have these 2 and these 2 to do. And then we have flying geese. So I'm not going to worry about that yet. We are going to go ahead and take these to the machine, and we're going to sew 1/4 inch off either side of that diagonal. Again, if you do not have clearly perfect angles, you'll want to take a ruler and a Frixion pen and mark your diagonal from corner to corner and sew 1/4 inch off either side. If you have your clearly perfect angles like so, what you'll do is you will have your squares directly on top of each other, and instead of marking your diagonal, you're going to align it, so pretend your needle is at the needle point, to the areas that are marked B. So you have your edges aligned here and your point at this bottom edge. You're going to sew straight, or straight as that was, straighter than that, rotate it, and then sew the other side. Okay, so we are going to do that with all of these pieces. I'm going to go ahead and take these over to the machine. So we have quite a bit of half square triangles that we need to be making. And then when you are using your clearly perfect angles, what you'll want to do is make sure that you have everything aligned correctly. Even though you are going to be trimming these down, a straight line will help your half square triangles stay straight and not get super wonky. So I tend to chain piece all of my half square triangles. What that means is I don't cut thread in between every single square. We go ahead and just start sewing. And I'll do one side of all the squares. One side of every square before I then cut all of the chain piecing apart. And sew the other side. The difference I feel like in this case is the first side is always slower. And the reasoning behind that is you're having to align all of your blocks before you put it through your machine. So you make sure all your edges and everything is aligned. And then when you put it through your machine, they're already sewn together. So when you flip your squares around to do the other stitch line, you don't really have that alignment. So you just kind of stick it through your machine and go. So all of these half square triangles will be trimmed to the same amount, well, the same size, I mean. And that measurement is located within your pattern. But we are going to go ahead and trim them after we get all of this sewn together. The other thing that might be super handy today is to have some design boards out and ready to go for your pieces. Design boards are super handy in the sense that when you sew your blocks together, you ensure that you don't rotate a half square triangle accidentally or a square accidentally, and you are able to sew correctly and accurately. This is my last square to sew the first pass. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut all of these squares apart and we're going to sew the other side. So there's quite a few. I typically like to make all of my half square triangle units at one time because it's a little bit, I don't want to say mindless sewing, but it's much faster to do the same thing in a repetitive motion before we start doing the next steps. So now that we have all that cut apart, I'm going to rotate my blocks 180 degrees and we're going to sew the other side. Again, the larger squares will end up being your hourglass blocks. Those do not get trimmed. They will get trimmed after you create the hourglass block. So as a half square triangle, they do not get trimmed. Half square triangles do get trimmed down to size. What that means is as long as you're sewing a straight line, it'll be fine. Oh, I didn't turn off the autofocus for that, did I? You know what it is? Whenever I leave my ruler there by accident, it tries to focus on the ruler, which is not what I want it to do. Okay, I think that's fine. Thank you for letting me know that. I forgot to turn autofocus off. So as long as you're sewing straight, you're okay. You are trimming them down to size, so if you accidentally hit just a hair to the left or right of that line, you're okay, because you are going to be trimming it down. You cannot really fix it if you don't sew straight. So if you sew and you go whoop halfway through it, it's going to be really hard to trim them to the correct size because you don't have a straight line to begin with. I would say that in that case, you should talk, or you should think about wanting to unpick and restitch that straight line. Okay, so we have our half square triangles. The first thing that we're going to do in this case is we're actually going to cut these in half on the diagonal. If you've noticed, I flipped over the square, so instead of cutting on the white, I'm cutting on the print fabric, and the reason is I can see my stitch line a little bit better on the print fabric than I can on the white because I'm using white thread. I'm going to essentially align my 1/4 inch on the seam allowance, or the actually stitch line, and cut down diagonally. So if I did it correctly, this should be 100% on the diagonal of the square. Now, if it's not 100% on the diagonal of the square, that is also okay. What ends up happening is that's in the seam allowance, and it's going to be kind of tucked in underneath, and it'll be fine. Just make sure you're not cutting it too close to either side of your stitch lines to reduce your seam allowance so small that you're going to have problems with that seam setting. Okay? Or like, what I mean by seam setting is like it's not going to pull apart because your seam allowance is so small. As long as you have something there for it to stay, you should be in good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut all of these apart. When I get to the larger squares that are for the hourglass blocks, I'm going to go ahead and press those open before I even trim the other half square triangles. And the reason why I want to do that is I want to be very clear to myself that I am not trimming those half square triangles. It's like super key. Don't trim your half square triangles when you make hourglass blocks. Okay, so these two are my hourglass blocks. They're bigger. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and press these open. So for the pressing instructions for these, for this entire pattern, you can press your blocks in any way that you want, as long as you are okay with the fact that you may or may not have some clashing seams in the quilt. Otherwise, recommended to press your seams open. I personally do not like pressing seams open, and I will deal with the fact that if I get clashing seams, I will deal with that, right? Like I'm okay with it. So in my lens, I will always be pressing open. So I will be pressing these squares to fabric C, or the blue fabric, on these half square triangles that will become hourglass blocks. So I'm going to set these aside for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and start trimming the rest of my half square triangles. So what's going to end up happening, depending on what size you want, you're going to align your stitch line to the dotted line for whatever size you're trimming this to on your triangle. All right, that's the most important one. And then for a half square triangle, all you're doing is, do you see fabric all the way around? And if you do, go ahead, align your stitch line, cut both sides, and your dog ears. And you want to be careful to take your hand out of the way, but then now your half square triangle will be pressed open and it'll be a perfect HST. So we're gonna go ahead and trim all of these half square triangles. So the important piece is making sure that your stitch line is on the stitch line of the ruler. If it is not, you have the risk of cutting this the wrong size and or ending up with a really funky shape at the end because your stitch line is somewhere not anywhere close to being correct. Other kind of things to think about for this ruler, make sure you have your ruler sprayed with Grippy. The rulers come naturally slick, which then make it want to slide as you're using it as a ruler, which then if you're cutting these dog ears in, the dog ears will make it fancy so when you press, you don't have any trimming whatsoever, right? Like that's what's the beauty of these rulers, is you trim two sides, the dog ears, and you're pretty much done. What ends up happening if you have a slick ruler is you run the risk of the ruler slipping on you as you're cutting, so you get an incorrect cut. And because you're cutting dog ears in this, a slip on this ruler means you may slice your own hand, which is fairly dangerous and would hurt a lot. So Grippy is a product made by O'Deef. It is a washable product, so it does wear off over time. And you can see on my Trimmer A ruler where I used to pick up the ruler and I've worn it off, where my hand keeps touching it. My fingers essentially wore off the Grippy on that side. In order to get the rest of the Grippy off the ruler, what you would do is run it under warm water. Like you can wash it with soapy warm water, and the spray on the back of the ruler washes right off. Then you dry your ruler, and then you can go ahead and respray the back of your ruler with the same product again and get that same grippy grippiness back on the back of the ruler, I guess. And again, you want the grippiness on the back of the ruler. I don't think I said that earlier. But that is what kind of helps the ruler not move around. Kind of see me tuck my fingers away. Make sure that I'm not getting it in the way of my rotary cutter. It'd be really bad to have a sliced finger or sliced hand on stream. It's not good. Yes, O'Deef. Correct. It's O'Deef Grippy. They are a product that, or they're a company that makes multiple different products. They actually have a lot of different products for the scrapbooking industry, actually. But they also make our 505 basing spray for quilting. They make a fabric stiffener. They make permanent and temporary adhesive for fabric. And they make Grippy. Oh, and then another product that I also use is called Odie Coat, which then is a product that you can spread onto fabric to kind of waterproof it. So you can make your own kind of waterproofed bag or purse by just coating the fabric in Odie Coat. Other thing, I use a Olfa rotary cutter, but I have the ability to cover the blade on the left and right side. When you're using clearly slotted trimmers, you need to have both sides open if your rotary cutter has the ability to do that. The reasoning is with the blade coverage, it doesn't quite get into the dog ear trimmer as nicely. So if you have one of their splash ruler or splash rotary cutters that only has one single blade guard, it's not going to be a problem. It's really if you have two or a split blade guard and or the other like half blade guard rotary cutters, that getting the proper angle into the dog ear cutters becomes a little bit of a problem. So pro tip, keep both of them open and then just be careful with your fingers. I went to having the dual covers on this because I have sliced my finger before by putting my finger on the blade. It was really dumb. So now with having the other guard on the top when I'm not using my clearly slotted trimmers, that kind of helps shield the blade from my hand. All right. Hi, Tessa. Ooh, rain sounds fantastic. It's like the best way to sleep. In my opinion, that's having lots of rain. So, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and press these. I'm gonna press them to our print fabric, so away from the background and or press towards the blue, which is fabric C in this case. And then, so now I have all of these half square triangles essentially just waiting to be used. I'm going to set them aside for now because these units are done until we start sewing the blocks together. Okay. The next unit that we're going to finish making is our hourglass block. In our hourglass block, we're going to use the 4 half square triangles that we had made with the larger squares up here. We're going to take one of each, and we are going to put that fabric C, which is the dark blue, not on top of each other, okay? So they're going to be on the opposite sides, and then we're going to make half square triangles or hourglass blocks from those squares. I'll show you how that gets aligned. Alright, so we have those. There are a lot of half square triangles in this month, so make sure you're taking your time to trim them appropriately and that you're sewing straight. It gets really difficult if you don't sew straight. I do find when I am tired and not paying attention, I don't sew straight. It is kind of weird. It just kind of, the fabric pulls one way, or I accidentally pull it one way when I'm guiding it in there. It's less of a guide and more of a pull by accident. And so that way I do try to pay attention when I'm sewing. Okay, so the next part, we're going to take the big half square triangles that we've made that we did not trim. We're going to take one of each. We're going to put the blue on opposite sides of each other, right sides together like so, and nest these seams. So if you are pressing your seams open, you'll want to make sure that this seam line is on the same side. And then what you're going to do is you're going to sew or draw a line on the diagonal if you don't have clearly slotted trimmers. And you're going to draw a line on the diagonal. You're going to sew 1/4 inch on either side. And you're going to do that same thing for the other pair. Okay, because what that's going to mean is you sew here, you're going to end up with an hourglass block. Okay, we're going to go ahead and sew those. It's always good to have a relaxing Saturday. Nothing wrong with that. So once you've done one side, you'll trim them or cut your thread and sew the other side. All right, so now that these are sewn and ready to be pressed into the final half square, or no, goodness, the final hourglass block, we are actually going to cut these apart and then we're going to trim them. So very similar to our half square triangles that we just did. I'm going to go ahead, cut these apart. And then on our clearly slotted trimmer, the fun part about this is we have this center line of where this hourglass block first was sewn, right? So this is our hourglass block. We also have this really handy dandy center line on our clearly perfect trimmers. And so we're actually going to look at both of those stitch lines, the vertical one and the horizontal one, align the center and align the stitch line before we cut the sides and then the dog ears. Okay. So what that does is now when I go press this open, I have a perfect hourglass block. Oops. All right, so I cut off one dog ear, but did not cut off the other one. So I'm going to go back and realign my stitch lines and cut my dog ear. My dog ear, as long as I didn't cut the stitch line up here, should be fine. I could have actually left it and then just trimmed it off after I pressed him open, or trimmed him off with some scissors. It doesn't matter. It was just faster to use a rotary cutter to trim them off. All right, so we're going to do that for this last one. Throw away the trimmings, and I'm going to go ahead and press my hourglass blocks. All right, so as a reminder, we are only making one set of each of the blocks today on stream. The instructions are made so you are making all of them at one time, so you're making all the units for all the blocks you need for month 4. So you'll be making more of them. But in essence of time and whatnot, I'm just making one of each kind. The next set we're going to do is we are going to make some traditional flying geese. We first have 2 flying geese where both of the little wings are going to be background fabric. Okay. And then we are going to have 2 of them where the left-hand side is background fabric and the right-hand side are shells. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and take all 4 of these over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew my right-hand side first because that's the side that's different. So I have 2 background and 2 shells. Oh, I should actually talk about how we do that. So to sew flying geese, in this case, if you don't have clearly slotted or clearly perfect angles, you will sew, you'll align one rectangle to the right. You will sew directly on this line. So you would draw corner to corner. And unlike your half square triangles where you're sewing a 1/4 inch away, you're going to sew directly on that line. If you have clearly perfect angles, on the other hand, what you'll do is you'll set this up and you'll have your big rectangle aligned with the 45-degree line. You'll have your small square aligned with your needle and the center where the gray and the green meet. And as you sew, you'll just go straight in this direction. And you'll follow that line straight through. Yes, so the clearly slotted trimmers make a huge difference. And if you pair that with the clearly slotted, or the clear angles, good grief, what is it called? Clearly perfect angles, in my opinion, they make a world of difference on not having to draw all of your diagonal lines. Because you don't need to draw diagonal lines for hourglass blocks, half square triangles, stitch and flip corners, flying geese, like none of that. And it's a huge time saver in my opinion. Okay. So last one. Any flying geese, one of the things that I want to talk to you guys about, or really any stitch and flip corners, I'm going to remind everybody, the thing that you have to double check is when you are pressing these open, that this triangle replaces that triangle that was part of the fabric before. Okay, so you want to technically test to make sure, yep, is this still the same size rectangle as I started with? Stitch and flip corners should never be bigger or smaller than what you started with. And that is a really good way to test. And if it's too big, you need to adjust. If it's too small, you also need to adjust your stitch line. For me, I trust myself and I will trim off my excess fabric. But if you're a newer quilter, absolutely double check and test them before you cut fabric, because if you're wrong, by the way, you can't stitch back fabric you already cut off. So, just pro tip. Once you have sewn a lot of these stitch and flip corners, you'll be able to tell, was your line off or were you close enough to the straight edge line that your rectangle will look fine at the end. Okay. Now, for the other side of these flying geese, the other side is all background fabric, so I'm not too super concerned. Same thing, we're going to line it with the left side now of the rectangle, and we're going to stitch diagonal to diagonal this way to make a triangle. Okay, and we're going to do that for all 4 of these. Again, if you don't have clearly perfect angles, drawing the diagonal is paramount to make sure that you are stitching directly on that diagonal. The other thing, depending on what type of needle plate you have on your machine, if you have an oval needle plate, it's sometimes easier to start your flying geese in the middle versus the corner. So if you start with the corner into your machine, and you have an oval needle plate, sometimes what happens is that corner gets sucked down into that machine. And so you'll actually want to start on this side versus the tip. I love HSTs. Like, I really do. I think they're super versatile and they are used in a lot of different, designs. Those 4 done. We are going to go ahead and trim these and press them. And then what that means is we are pretty much done. Oops, I need to trim these first. We are pretty much done with all of the extra units that we're going to need for this block. And we are going to go start our block assembly. So the next thing after this is we're going to pull up a design board and lay out our first block. Actually, we're not quite done yet. I forgot I had you guys make quadrants for this first block. But that's okay. All right, so we have a couple quadrants that we're going to be doing. All right, so with this block here, we have these 2 like so. Okay, and then with this one with the shells, you're going to match those with the shells. Like this. Okay. And so I'm going to sew these top ones together before I make the quadrants. So these 2 go together and these 2 go together. And because I'm going to chain piece them all together, I'm just sewing them one after another. Makes this portion go pretty quickly. If you like pressing seams to one side, this is where I do give you a little bit more instruction on how to press them so that all of your seams will nest for this block. Otherwise, you will end up potentially with a lot of clashing seams. So I did give you guys a little bit of help. If you like pressing seams to one way, if you like pressing your seams open, have at it. Get the whole quilt can be made with your seams pressed open. And honestly, if you press your seams open you actually end up with 0 clashing seams. All right. So we are going to go and press these, actually this direction, to the left. All of these get pressed to the left, like so. So this is what these look like. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew these together. All right, so I'm going to do that. We are essentially making this block into quadrants to be able to be sewn like a 4-patch. So right sides together, make sure everything's aligned. This point needs to be matching where that seam allowance is. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. But that will also help you make sure that your seams and everything are correct. Okay, so then now we're going to press all of our seams to the half square triangle, so away from the flying geese. And we're going to end up with 4 quadrants. That's 1. So now, because we have essentially quadrants, I'm going to sew the top row together and the bottom row together. These 2 together, these 2 together, and then sew the long seam together. What I'm going to do though is I'm not actually going to cut this in the middle. I'm just going to go ahead and sew this like so and treat it like I'm web piecing this block together. And now this square, my center seams nest and my flying geese and hourglass block, or no, so flying geese and half square triangle block seams nest as well. Everything gets to be a little nested. Actually, this seam, it's not where I'm sewing, but it's the one that I will next. I gotta go repress that. It kind of got pressed a little funky, but I can do that. Change. So now we have half and half. And now I'm going to go ahead and press my seams in opposite directions. So now I have these two. I just screwed up that seam as well. Let me fix that real quick. So there we go. I'm going to fold these in half. I'm going to pin my seams. Like that one's kind of ironed a little funky. But now all of these quadrant seams should be nesting as well. So I use fork pins to nest my seams. They pin on either side of the seam to then stabilize the piece so they don't tend to move once you've pinned it down. Okay. Fork pinned, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew that together. Take the pins out, and this block is ready to be pressed. So this is month 4, block A. This block is the one that you will need 4 of for the quilt, and it looks like this. Ta-da! All right, so that is block A. Block B is what is left with all of the other pieces, okay? So that's block A. I'm going to use a design board for this because there is quite a few pieces in this block. All right. So, number 1, we have this here. And we are going to, I left some of these squares over here. We are going to start laying out this block. So we have fabric C. I forgot what letter this is. These are in the corners of this block. And then we have fabric B pretty much right next to them in every corner, like so. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, yep, it's the same direction as the one in the corner pointing inwards. All right. And then the next layer around, we have some just plain white squares. If I can move it, there we go. Like so. So I'm kind of working in a circle fashion all the way around. And then we have our hourglass blocks, and our hourglass blocks look like so, with fabric B towards the middle. And then fabric C has a square in the middle too, which I forgot to grab. So let me grab a square from that. And so this is what the month 4 block B looks like. Now this block is 100% a grid. So what's going to happen is I'm going to go ahead and web piece this entire block. And that means I'm going to take column 1 and column 2 and sew them together. Then I'm going to add column 3, 4, and 5. And I'm not going to cut in between every single one of them. I'm going to keep them all together. So when I'm done, these strips are all sewn together. And I'll come and press, and then I'll sew the strips together. And what's going to end up happening is as I'm sewing each of the columns on, so adding pieces, I'm going to go and finger press the seams in the directions that I choose. So first steps first, I'm going to take column 2, fold it over column 1. And I'm going to sew my block. Okay. So this is the method that I normally use to sew my quilt tops together. I lay out all of my quilt blocks onto a design wall. And if I end up in a grid fashion, what's going to happen is I'm going to go ahead and just web piece the quilt top together. The only difference, in my opinion, from sewing a quilt top versus a block together is I tend to finger press on a web piece block versus a web piece quilt top. Because with the web piece quilt top, there seems to be a lot of bigger seams, and those are harder to finger press than a block, honestly. Like that is 100% the reason. So now that I have those set up, I'm gonna cut the thread. And then I'm gonna go ahead and alternate my seams, so left, right, just because I think that's what's gonna look nicer with my pieces. I'm going to go ahead and pull off my third column like so. And I finger press as I go. So I just finger press the first one. I'm going to add the piece here from the third column. And then I'm going to finger press the second row. Add the piece from the third column. And so on and so forth. But that's the process that I go through to web piece this block. And I'm alternating and tracking which way I'm pressing my seams to make sure that the rows, when I get to sewing the rows together, will all nest. So I like pressing seams towards non-sewn units, so anything that's a solid block or square, I will press towards that way. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and grab column 4. So I'm going from top to bottom in the order that is on the design wall, because that way it helps me understand which order I need to sew on to my block. That's all. That is 100% how to keep your blocks from going haywire and moving in the wrong direction. Or rotating, rather. Normally I'd even have the design wall sitting right next to me, so it's much easier for me to get the pieces off the design wall. I'm picking them off one at a time, and that way I know I'm not screwing it up as I'm pulling it off. Okay. Again, we are working on month 4, block B. Ultimately, there are 2 of these blocks that you will need to make. So I'm only making one of the 2 month 4B blocks. So now we've done 4, we're going to take the last column and we're going to add that to what we've already done to finish out the rows. So this is month 4, block A. You'll need to make 4 of those. And 2 of the block B's, which is what we're sewing now. as you see through all the different months, we're building on essentially the same skill sets and putting our blocks in a little different way to create some, you know, different and fun designs. So really, this quilt, once we have mastered the basics, these Block of the Month quilts just reinforce all of those skill sets. So here is our rows. I'm going to go ahead and take this to the iron. That last set of, like that last column, right? So column 5 was not finger pressed, but I can easily go ahead and do that here at the iron. And then hit all of the other seams with the iron as well. Just to make sure that those are all set. Ironing all of these. All right. So now we have 5 rows, okay? We are going to go ahead and sew all of these together. Oops, I should probably fix that. All of your seams should nest because you were finger pressing them as you were going. You can decide whether or not you want to pin these. On the smaller web piece blocks, for me, it's, if you're sewing pretty decently, your pieces don't move that much. But for a quilt top or something you're web piecing, I usually pin. So now we are going to go ahead and sew this together. Interestingly enough, I always start on one side, but then for row 2, I'll actually rotate the piece to have the piece that we're adding be on top. So I essentially fold the seams at where they nest to finish that off. So now we have rows 1 and 2 sewn together. I'm going to rotate this around. So I'm going to move the center over the middle and 180. So the center column to the second column. I guess it could be rows. I guess it's really just your perspective of how you're holding your piece. All right. And so then now we have those 3 done. If you notice, I'm just going to go add the next one. You can go to the iron and press these seams after you sewed them, but this block is large enough where I don't feel like it's going to get in the way. If you are sewing with like 1.5 inches or smaller or something, with smaller blocks, like your square size is smaller, I would recommend pressing in between them, but because these are big enough, I don't see an issue. Like, they don't get in the way if I don't press them. Now, don't get me wrong, I will press them when the whole block is finished. I'm just meaning like I don't sew the row and then press it immediately. Okay. So we have one more seam to sew, which is that top one. I'll fold that over. with all 5 rows sewn together, I'm going to now take it to the iron and press every single one. And what ends up happening is I will essentially press them all in a single direction versus alternating these seams. Like these seams will all go pressed in one way. So individually I'll go and press them. The biggest thing, I think, the limiting factor of why I would press or would not press in between every row is will the iron, like, will I run into problems with the iron being too big with my block size? So sometimes if your blocks are smaller and you're using a big iron, that's when you want to press every time just because then your iron will get stuck if it's not. But otherwise, these blocks I press at the end. They are big enough for me to be able to do that. And voila! This is month 4, block B, and you'll be making 2 of these for this quilt. So 2 block Bs, 4 block As, and that is month 4. Thank you guys so much for hanging out today. I'm going to actually save this video, and so if you are doing this at a later time, you will be able to come back and see this. And if you're looking for a different month, check out the other videos on my YouTube channel and follow along. I'll see you guys later. Thank you.